Hi there, I'm T, and this is Great Clacton's Ask a Pastor. We are in the middle of a series where we're answering your questions about the Bible, and right now we're right in the middle of sort of a mini-series within that, where we're answering the question, who wrote the Bible? And last week I talked a little bit about why I talked a lot about why I think that the traditional view of who wrote the books of the Bible is largely correct. There's a few exceptions here and there, but they're not very significant. And so this week we're going to actually start looking at the books of the Bible and who is traditionally believed to have written them. We're going to start with the New Testament because you'll remember, as I've said, if you're just starting to read the Bible, the New Testament is where you should start, and specifically with the Gospels, the books that are written about the life of Jesus. In fact, today we're going to look at 3 of the Gospels and the book of Acts, and we're going to save the rest of the New Testament for next week. But as I said, the New Testament starts out with the 4 Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life. And the names that we've given to those books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And traditionally, it's believed that those books were written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Although it's important to point out that if you actually go through and read those books of the Bible, you'll notice that nowhere in the actual text does the person that wrote them write down his name or claim to be any particular person. What happened is that after these books were written, and then they were copied and passed on and handed around to different churches around the world so that people would have this account of what the life of Jesus was like, that the people that passed the books around would sometimes add notes to them, like a cover page. And one of the things that they found most important was to write down who had written it or who they believed had written it. And so from very, very early on, you had copies of the book of Mark, for example, being passed around saying that this was written by Mark. And the book of John saying this was written by John. So the books themselves don't say who wrote them, but very early on these names got attached by the church to these books, to these documents. So we're going to look at who these men were. We're not going to look at the Gospel of John this week. I'm going to save that for next week for a few reasons. One, because actually exploring who it was who wrote the book of John is a bit more complicated than you might expect. But also, there are 5 different books in the New Testament that we generally believe were written by someone named John. And the other 4 come right at the very end of the New Testament, and I want to discuss all of those together. But we'll look at the other 3 Gospels and the book of Acts today. So the very first Gospel, as I just said, is Matthew. And Matthew was written by one of Jesus' apostles, a man named Matthew. And Matthew was a tax collector. Now, to sort of set the scene, God's people, the Jews, those who were descended from Abraham, were set apart by God. They were given God's law through Moses. And so they saw themselves as being God's people. They were answerable only to God. And even when the Israelites had a king, in theory, the king was God's representative and they were responsible to God through the king. That didn't always work out that way, but in theory that's what it was. And so God's people at the time of Jesus, the Israelites, the Jews, they believed that they should serve only God and no one else. Except they lived right in the middle of the Roman Empire. They were ruled by Rome. They were controlled by Rome. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, at the time Jesus died, had his palace right next to the temple in Jerusalem. And the really religious Jews, all the Jewish people hated it, but the really religious Jews just thought that this was the worst thing possible, that they were forced to serve another nation, the ruler of another nation, someone who not only wasn't God, but wasn't even a fellow Jew like them. And when the Romans, one of the ways they controlled their territory was through taxes. And so they would choose certain people to have the responsibility of collecting the taxes from all the people in a certain area. And as you might imagine, those tax collectors were not very popular. Not only because they would come and take your money, but much, much more seriously, because they were Jewish people who were seen to be corroborating with the enemy, with the Romans. So they weren't just sort of greedy, they were treacherous. And so often when you find people interacting with Jesus in the Gospels, one of the accusations that they level at him is that he associates with sinners, and tax collectors were chief among the sinners that Jesus was accused of spending time with. And it's really no wonder, because as I said, that Matthew was a tax collector, and he became one of Jesus's closest followers, one of his apostles. And actually, I think that right now is a really good time to take a slight detour and talk about the difference between a disciple and an apostle, because those are two terms that a lot of people will either get confused or just assume they mean exactly the same thing. Now, a disciple is someone who would attach himself or herself to a teacher, and they would travel around with that teacher. They would assist the teacher in whatever it is that he had to do. And it wasn't just Jesus who had disciples. Any great teacher among the Jewish people would have disciples. For example, John the Baptist had disciples. And as John the Baptist's ministry sort of started to fade, John actually sent some of his disciples to follow Jesus, and they became Jesus' disciples. And what those disciples would do, it was their job to learn what it is that the teacher had to teach. They would sometimes literally sit at his feet, hearing him teach, and they would listen over and over and over again. He would sometimes teach them privately, but also the teacher would teach publicly, and the disciples would sit there listening, memorizing the things that the teacher would teach, because it would be their job to one day pass on what they had learned to other people. Then Jesus spent 3 years traveling around Judea and Galilee, teaching people about God. And in each of the Gospels, some of Jesus' teachings are recorded. But I think it's really important to keep in mind when we're reading through the Gospels that when sort of a story that Jesus has told is recorded, or a saying or a teaching is recorded in a specific place, for example, is like in the Sermon on the Mount, or in Capernaum, or somewhere or other, that Jesus almost definitely said that thing in that time and place, but he probably said the same thing many, many, many other times in other places. And that's important to keep in mind for a couple of reasons. First, because if you read a couple of the gospel accounts and you find that one has Jesus telling a story one way, and another writer has Jesus telling a story a slightly different way, it's not necessarily that one of them made a mistake, but that most likely Jesus told the same story in slightly different ways at different times. But it's also important to keep that in mind, because you had Jesus' disciples, many of them, dozens. In fact, at one point, Jesus sent out 72 of his disciples to go and spread his teaching around Galilee and Judea, that you had dozens and dozens of people who knew his teachings well enough, because they heard them over and over and over again, that they had memorized them. And that helps to give us assurance that what we read in the Bible, the words of Jesus, are the actual words of Jesus. Because it's not just one man trying to remember what Jesus might have said, but it was a man who spent years listening to Jesus saying the same things over and over and over, purposely trying to memorize them so he could pass them on, who also had dozens of other people around him doing the same thing, who could verify what he wrote when it came time for him to write it down. So we don't know exactly how many disciples Jesus had, but he had a lot of disciples. As I said, at one point he had enough to send 72 out to teach, and those were almost definitely all men, but he also had women disciples, and chances are he didn't actually take all of his disciples and send them all out, because not all of them would have been ready for that. So it's very likely that Jesus could have had up to hundreds of disciples at some point during his ministry. And out of all of those disciples, he chose 12 men to be his apostles. And the apostles were all disciples of Jesus, but they were trained even more by Jesus himself, because they were going to have a greater responsibility in building up and leading God's people once Jesus himself returned to heaven. And so Matthew was both a disciple and an apostle. And so that's really striking when you think about it, that Matthew was someone who was despised by his own people for being a traitor. And yet God trusted him enough, our Lord Jesus trusted him enough, that he called him not just to follow him and be his disciple, but to have the responsibility of being one of the leaders of his people. And then he took that responsibility even further and wrote down the story of the life of Jesus, so that anyone that wanted to could read about the things that Jesus said and did. And of course, most of what he wrote down would have been things that he himself had experienced. So that's Matthew. We'll move on to Mark. Now, the book of Mark was probably written by a man that we refer to as John Mark. Now, John Mark was a young man living in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death. He even may have been among the disciples who were in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, but we don't know that for sure. What we do know about him is that his mother was among the first Christians. Because we know that because in the book of Acts, we learn that the Apostle Peter was arrested by King Herod for sharing the gospel, for telling people about Jesus. And they were really worried about what was going to happen to Peter, because Herod had recently killed James, the brother of John, one of Jesus' three closest apostles. But what happened to Peter is that he was freed, not by people, but by an angel. An angel came and miraculously freed him from prison. And when Peter realized that he actually was truly free, he went to a house that he knew. And so I'm going to read from Acts chapter 12. So when Peter realized he was free, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things here. First of all, even though we refer to him as John Mark today, that's not how he was referred to back when he was alive. Here he's called John, whose other name was Mark. That means that he was sometimes called John, but also he was sometimes referred to as Mark. And there's a couple of very good reasons why he would have had more than one name. One has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned, the Jews were living under Roman occupation. And so they were Jewish people, but they also, whether they liked it or not, they were part of the greater Roman culture. And so a lot of people would go by more than one name. They would have a Jewish name, like John, and then they would have a Roman name, like Mark. And they might use one or the other in different contexts. But another reason why they talk about John here, or John Mark, as John whose other name is Mark, is because at the time that Jesus was alive, there were a few names that were used over and over and over and over and over again. Almost everyone had them. And John was one of those names. As you know, one of the other Gospels, we believe, was written by someone named John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, there's a good reason we call Mark Mark. It's because if we called him John, that would be really confusing. We'd have two books of the Bible written by people named John. And you also, even though John, who's also known as Mark, is mentioned in this passage, the passage has nothing to do with him. The only reason he's mentioned at all is because the passage is talking about his mother. And his mother's name was Mary, which you probably know is one of the most common, it was the most common woman's name at the time Jesus was alive. And so they had to, if they wanted you to know which Mary they were talking about, they had to give you some bit of information so that you would know. So, for example, it was the house of Mary, who was the mother of John, who's also known as Mark. So she was identified by her son, who apparently was known well enough in the early Christian community that people could then identify, oh, that this was the house that she went to. But we also know that John's mother Mary, Mark's, I'll refer to him as Mark now, just to avoid confusion, that Mark's mother Mary was probably well off because she had a house that was large enough for a large group of Christians to gather together. But also she had at least one servant, and you can read more about that in Acts 12. And tradition also says, and this is not in the Bible, so we don't know if it's true, but there is a tradition that says that it was actually this house, the house that Peter went to after he was released from prison, the house of John Mark and his mother Mary, that was the house where Jesus held his Last Supper, which would have made it a natural gathering place for Christians after Jesus returned to heaven, and a natural place for Peter to go to when he was released suddenly from prison. But again, we don't know if it's true, but it's an interesting thing to consider. So, what we do know about Mark, once we start hearing about him as an individual and not just as a person identifying his mother, is that he went with the Apostle Paul and with Barnabas on their first missionary journey. But we also know that Mark abandoned them in the middle of the journey. We don't know why, but for some reason he left them and came home. So the next time Paul and Barnabas went to start up their next missionary journey, Mark said he wanted to come along, and that he he'd be good at this time, he'd stick with them. And Barnabas, who was probably Mark's cousin, he wanted to give Mark another chance, but Paul said, no way, nope, you blew it, I'm not going to deal with that again. And in fact, Paul and Barnabas disagreed so strongly that they ended up splitting and going their separate ways. And Barnabas did go off with Mark, and Paul went off with someone named Silas. But apparently by the end of Paul's life, he had reconciled with Mark, because in 2 of his last letters, Paul refers to Mark as one of his fellow workers. But Mark also had a very close relationship with the Apostle Peter. And again, tradition, not the Bible, but tradition tells us that it was Peter's account of things that happened in the life of Jesus that Mark wrote down. Mark spent a lot of time with Peter, hearing all about Jesus' ministry, and that's what he wrote down when it came time for him to write his gospel. And in fact, in one of Peter's letters, which is in the New Testament, he refers to Mark as his son. And it doesn't mean he was literally Mark's father, but that he saw him as his spiritual son because they were that close in their relationship. So then we come to Luke. Now, Luke wrote 2 books in the New Testament. He wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he also wrote the book of Acts. Now, the Gospel of Luke tells the story of Jesus' life, and Luke wrote that first. And Acts is sort of like a sequel to that. Sometime later, after he'd finished writing the record of Jesus' life, he decided to write down the things that happened with the apostles after Jesus ascended to heaven. And so that's what the book of Acts is. And actually, if you were to count by words written between these 2 books, Luke wrote more of the New Testament than any other person. But who was Luke? He was a physician, a doctor. He was a man of science, a man of reason. And that becomes really important when you start thinking about what it is that he did in putting together both the gospel, the story of Jesus' life, and the book of Acts, because it was really important to him to get things right. In fact, if we look at the very beginning of Luke, again, he doesn't say that he wrote it. It doesn't say, I'm Luke and I've written this, but tradition very early on tells us that it was the physician Luke who wrote this book. He gives us a reason why he wrote it. He says that many have taken it up to write a narrative of the things that have happened, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, they have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. So Luke is basically saying, okay, lots of people are talking about what happened. I'm going to take and research and put down in an orderly way exactly what happened, so that you can know for certain that these things that you've heard so many stories about are actually true. Because Luke cared about truth. As a man of science, he wanted proof. He wanted to know what really happened. Now, and that's important because Luke himself never met Jesus in person. He only knew of the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did by hearing about them, hearing first-hand accounts from people who had actually been there with Jesus. And also, he traveled to a lot of the places where Jesus had been, so he could see for himself where things had happened and talk to people that had experienced those things. And at some point, I don't know where it was in terms of writing the gospel, but at some point during the missionary journeys of Paul, Luke joined up with him. So that a lot of the things that Luke writes about Paul experiencing in the book of Acts, Luke experienced himself right there along with Paul. And Luke became a very, very important companion to Paul. Paul endured a lot. If you read the book of Acts, you'll see just how much Paul went through in order to share the gospel with the rest of the world. And we'll talk more about Paul next week. But Paul endured an incredible amount, including being imprisoned. He spent the last years of his life in prison in Rome until finally Nero had him executed. And Luke was one of the only companions that stuck with him through everything. In fact, in what might be the last letter that we have of Paul's, Paul's writing to a young man named Timothy, who's sort of his spiritual son, the same way that Mark was Peter's spiritual son. And two things are striking. One is that Paul asked Timothy to come to him if he can, and he asked him to bring Mark, the one that he hadn't wanted to come with him before. As I said, he changed his mind and reconciled with Mark later in life. So he asked Timothy to bring Mark with him, but also he makes a point of saying that the only one that's left with me is Luke. That Luke was not just a man of science, not just someone who wanted to know the truth, but he was also fiercely loyal. So these are the men who wrote the first 3 books of the Bible. You have Matthew, the tax collector, who was seen as a traitor to his people, who was redeemed by the Lord Jesus and became not just one of his apostles, but one of his evangelists, writing down the story of his life so that the world can know what Jesus did. And you have Mark, a young man who may or may not have taken Jesus seriously when Jesus was alive, who didn't really take seriously his first missionary journey for some reason or another, who over the course of his life got to the point where even the Apostle Paul desired to have him working alongside him again, and again, who was the first to write down history of the life of Jesus. And then Luke, the physician, who looked into everything as closely as he could to write down an orderly, true account of what really happened in Palestine 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus. I do hope this has been helpful to you to get an understanding of who are the real people behind the things that we read when we open up the Bible and read. And as always, if you're new to the Bible, haven't read much, these 3 books are some of the best places to start. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The book of Acts is also good as a follow-up to find out how Jesus was able to spread his kingdom even after he'd returned to heaven through the Acts of the Apostles. And as I said, next week we will tackle the rest of the New Testament. And then in a couple of weeks we'll get to the Old Testament. So I hope to see you again very soon. Goodbye.